I ended up calling the university and trying to work my way through all the operators and the secretaries and so on, and I finally got it, and they said, "This is the president's office," and I was like, oh, I all of a sudden feel nervous. But anyway, we have David with us this morning. I finally tracked him down and got him confirmed that he was coming, and he's here, and he's done a great job so far, and I know you'll enjoy what he has to say to us, so I'm going to invite him up now.
It is good to be with you at Waterview. We have really enjoyed the weekend with you. My wife Tracy is here, and since we're talking about marriage this weekend, I'll introduce her as my wife of 30 years. We met at Freed-Hardeman 32 years ago, and what a blessing it is that we can walk through life together and that our paths can cross with such great people. I commend Dustin and Megan on putting together a great weekend. Their attention to detail and their way to execute it, as well as the committee that is a part of that, really did a great job. It was neat to meet several guests that were also here this weekend from other congregations, and it's good to be here from Freed-Hardeman. I bring you greetings from Freed-Hardeman. This fall we'll begin celebrating our 150th anniversary, the oldest of the Christian colleges associated with the Churches of Christ, and we're really excited about this year coming up. We're excited that the year that we're in, we've already set 4 institutional highs. We have an all-time high of retention of freshmen, 82%. Second, retention of all students at 86%. And the graduation rate hit an all-time mark also, as well as undergraduates hit an all-time high of 1,548, and we almost hit an all-time high of all students at Freed-Hardeman, and we're at like 2,038. And so it's a special place. It's a place that really has formed a lot of our lives, and I know that this far away you have a lot of other Christian universities that are closer to, but it's neat also to run into so many here that have some kind of ties and some kind of roots to Freed-Hardeman. I appreciate the Oglesby and their foundation and their continual support through scholarships of students there. Well over 60,000, almost 70,000 through the years has been given, and 10,000 this past year, or this year that we're in, has been awarded to Bible majors, and we're thankful for that good. I appreciate Jason and Candy. I've known them not really well, but through the years for parts of 3 decades now, and it's always good whenever our paths can cross and be able to spend a little bit of time together. We've been studying through Song of Solomon. If you want to be open your Bibles there, we'll be looking in just a moment out of Song of Solomon, the 5th chapter, and we'll look at a little bit of the 5th chapter and parts of the 6th chapter as we move toward a close. I love the story. It's silly as can be, but I love the story of the church that's gathering in before worship starts one morning, and at the front of the building, the front of the auditorium, there's just this poof, this explosion, and smoke fills the room, and as the smoke settles, there's a figure there in a red suit, and a pitchfork, and a long tail, and the people they shudder and actually scream out, and they run to the back and run out in the foyer and peek in, and to their surprise and to the surprise of the one in the red suit, there's one guy that's just there on his regular pew, propped up against the edge, so relaxed, just like he always is. He's not afraid of the devil at all. And so that kind of irritates the devil. And so he walks over in his loud, thundering voice. He says, "Do you know who I am?" And he says, "Sure I do." He said, "Why aren't you afraid of me?" He says, "I've been married to your wife for 35 years. Why would I be afraid of you?" You know, when we think about marriage, we think about the reality that perhaps it's not always a smooth road. Perhaps it's not always easy. But I do think about the fact of how we like to act like it is. We like to pretend that it's easy. And I'm thankful that Tracy and I have been married enough years, and maybe we're just enough comfortable in our own skin that we don't mind saying it's not easy. We don't mind saying there's some tough potholes in the journey, and you can run through them as we sometimes do, and you can carefully steer around them. But it's not always going to be an easy ride. I think about doing some marriage counseling and premarital counseling one time, talking to a young couple, and she was so in love, as you would hope that a couple would be in premarital counseling. And so we got to the time where we were talking about conflict and resolving conflict. And I explained to him, I said, I hope the Lord gives you at least 50 years together. But I said, when you reach that 50-year mark, you're going to be able to look back. And not only will you say, there were some tough days in there, but you're going to remember there were some tough weeks. And some of those tough weeks are going to turn into tough months. And I said, out of 50 years, you're going to be able to look back at least at 1 or 2 years and say, wow, that was a tough season. And I kid you not, that precious little smile turned to the look of disaster. And in a soft, sweet voice, she said, are you serious? And I really didn't know for sure what but about what she said. I was surprised when you said there would be tough weeks. I can't imagine having tough months and for there really being a tough year. And I said, honey, let me tell you about our 7th year of marriage. I wouldn't relive that year for any amount of money. You couldn't pay me to relive that year. But I'm thankful we lived through that year. And I'm thankful we honored each other through that year. Through the difficult times, we continued to be who we should be so that we could really enjoy the 8th and the 9th year. And really in our first 10 years of marriage, if we probably had to say what were some of the best years, we would probably say 8, 9, and 10. But that 7th year was terrible. What about those couples that say, oh, well, we've been married and we don't have any conflict? Well, I don't know if they'd fall into one of these 3 categories, but I'd say most would fall into one of these 3 categories. One is some people just lie. Number two, and I'll come back to this one, but number 2 is the fact that you can learn how to not have conflict at all if you just agree that you will not be best friends and you will not live a close and intimate life together. You can pull enough distance between you that you won't have to deal with conflict. And then third, one of you can agree to become a doormat, and the other agree, I don't mind walking on you for the rest of our marriage. And so every time there's a decision to make, I want to do it my way. I'm just that selfish. And the other says, well, I am just of the character that I don't mind giving up my self-existence, and I'll walk on you. So whether it's where we're going to go to lunch today, or how we're going to discipline the kids, or where we're going to go on vacation, or what we're going to do with our life, and what are going to be life goals, I will always defer to you, and I will let you dominate and dictate my life. You wouldn't have any conflict in that way either. But let's go back to that second one. Have you noticed that usually best friends marry? But have you noticed, if you want to be real honest with yourself, that rarely do you reach your 50th anniversary in America and those couples are still best friends? Now, the reason, let me say that. Maybe if you reach your 50th, you are. But let me go back and say, out of everybody that's been married, if you go back 50 years, they're not best friends because over half of them divorced. And then even the ones that remain married, so we've already gotten rid of half, and then the ones that remain married, about half of them report that they're not really happily married. So we're now down to a pretty small percentage of the ones that gets married that even say, hey, we still have a good and strong relationship. So what happens? Why do we start pulling away? Well, one reason we start pulling away is because that thick layer of trust, which is a whole other discussion, but it is an important part of the discussion of conflict. Every great marriage is made up of a thick layer of trust in its foundation. What's your marriage standing on? Do you really trust your spouse? Do you trust how your spouse will react when you have to come in the afternoon and tell them the news that you know they don't want to hear? Well, we can get back to that a little bit later, but just think about that. Healthy relationships have a thick layer of trust. It's, wow, I know I'm going to have to tell them something they don't want to hear, but I trust the way they will react. But what about that couple that hasn't been married that long? Maybe it's the first or second year into marriage. And she has to come in and she has to say, honey, I know your car means everything to you. And I know you're real neat, and I know I borrowed it today, boy, I wish I wouldn't have borrowed it today because Dad, in the parking garage, I wasn't paying attention, and your front quarter panel is scratched all the way down, and I'm really sorry. And he blows up. He blows up and he says, you are so irresponsible. You're like raising a child. As a matter of fact, you're a lot like your parents. You know, I was visiting your parents the other day when we were there. I noticed your mom's car. There are dings on all four corners of her car. You know, that's why your parents are poor. You know, they can't take care of anything. Just think if you'd have been raised responsibly, then I wouldn't have to raise you. Sometimes I regret that I ever married you because I'm tired of raising children before we even have them. So what's going to happen the next time that she needs to come in and tell him something else that he doesn't want to hear? What's great communication? Great communication is always going to include openness and honesty. But great communication that's open and honesty will never continue if there's not trust. I remember the last time I was open and honest with you, it took me a month, it took me 6 months, it took me a year to get over the fact that I was open and honest with you. So I've learned something. When I live life close to you, I get hurt. But if I'm not open and honest with you and I pull away, I have found a way that I can live under the same roof. We can share the kids, we can share the bills, and we can even share some evenings out sometime. But as long as we don't share too closely in life, we don't fight. We don't have conflict. Yeah, my wife and I, we don't have conflict. We're not best friends anymore, and we don't really live a close and intimate life. I don't tell her everything. But wow, after we got past those first few years, they were really hard because we were open and honest with each other. But now we've learned how to not be. And wow, we get along just fine. Well, what keeps you together? Well, they don't realize this right now, but what keeps them together right now are the kids. The kids is what joins them together. And what they're not realizing is they've replaced those relationships of that closeness with somebody else. She doesn't realize how nice it is to have that guy at work that listens to her like her husband used to listen to her. And she can be open and honest with him, and he doesn't chew her out. And so the kids leave home, and they realize we don't have anything joining us together. And after all, I've realized over time that my closest friend on earth is the guy I talk with at work all the time. Maybe now's a good time for a divorce. Oh, that's just one scenario of many ways that it plays out. But the reality is, I'm giving you all that to say this. Please, 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 please don't ever brag on the fact that you and your spouse does not have conflict, because that reveals such an unhealthy approach to marriage. Healthy marriages are where you say, you know what, I'm an imperfect person, and I'm married to an imperfect person. We both have strong opinions about certain things. We both have certain likes and dislikes, and they don't always match up. We're of different genders. We're of different personalities. We come from different family origins. So you know what we do on a regular basis? Because we love and respect each other enough that we want each other to maintain their own identity as the person that God created them to be, we encourage each other to be that person, knowing that we're going to have a lot of disagreements along the way. We're going to disagree about little things, and we're going to disagree about big things. But what if? What if we can rely upon what God gives us that will help us learn to resolve our conflict so efficiently that it doesn't have to turn into a big fight? What if most of the time we resolve the conflict, maybe even so efficiently, it didn't even feel like a big moment of conflict? We've just learned to resolve it. Finding the solution is a lot better than focusing on the problem. Song of Solomon. It's a beautiful book of poetry that's found in the middle of the Old Testament, the 5 books of poetry. It's the only book of poetry that the theme is all about love. As a matter of fact, it's the only book in the Bible that from the first verse to the last verse, it's all about love. 8 chapters, the love between a man and a woman. We see them attracted to each other in the first few verses. We see them spending time together in the rest of the first chapter and the second chapter. They start seeing themselves really as an us instead of a me as we go into the rest of the second chapter. They now really identify themselves as a couple that's on the way to marriage. But you know what they have to do, at least in this poem, 2 times before they get married? They have to do what any godly couple has to do before marriage. They have to put the brakes on to the sexual relationship. Twice they have to say, do not stir nor awaken this love before it's time, because that's the way God made us. And godly people say, I'm going to respect God's guidelines on this topic. By the time we come down to the 3rd chapter, the last of the 3rd chapter is the wedding. Then we go into this question. Will the inspired holy pen lift itself and skip over the honeymoon, or will God, the God who created us as sexual beings, record the consummation of the marriage? And he records every detail. The most erotic chapter in all the Bible, the 4th chapter. The Hebrew people would not study the rest of Song of Solomon with their children 12 and under because of the sensitivity of the topic. Not because it's not appropriate for adults, though. How different would our churches be if we would speak very open and honestly like the Hebrew people did and still do, in the way God does all throughout the Scriptures? Isn't it sad, and I'm not saying you guys do this here, but isn't it sad that in a lot of churches, the only open and straightforward things that are said about our human sexuality is the no, don't. And God gives a whole book where about 2.5 chapters in it, He's given it all to the sexual relationship of the husband and wife, because between husband and wife, it's one of the beautiful, beautiful gifts that God gives. And God, in His honesty, closes out the honeymoon scene in the 5th chapter in verse 1. And what would the 5th chapter in verse 2 be about? The big fight. Isn't that beautiful, the way marriage works? You fall in love with your best friend, you think this is going to be just the great thing, smooth sailing, the honeymoon goes well, and right after the honeymoon, wow, they're not as easy to get along with as what I thought. You know, before, all those little things that I thought were so cute because they were different from me, now that we're married, they get on my last nerve because they're different from me. And so how are we going to resolve this conflict? Well, great couples that thrive, not couples that survive. Hopefully there's nobody here that looks at marriage and says, well, you know, if we've been married X number of years and we haven't divorced, I think we're doing pretty good. I'd put a time out there and ask you this. Are you just trying to survive in marriage? Or are you understanding that God gave us the gift of marriage to be holy matrimony? And our marriages is supposed to be an example of Christ in the church. Our marriages should make a statement, not only to our children and our grandchildren, and not only to the church family that surrounds us. Our marriages should make a statement to everybody that's in our community that we are a reflection of Christ in everything that we are in marriage. Listen, marriages that belong to Christ should never be on the verge of survival and say, that's fine with me. Instead, we ought to want Christ to be magnified in the way that we love and care for each other, just as Christ has for the church, Ephesians 5. And so it's interesting when God says, I want to give you a love story. I'm going to give you 8 chapters in this love story. Isn't it interesting that 2 of those chapters cover the time of conflict that they have for each other? Now, to understand these 2 chapters, or even to understand the book, we need to understand that it's just like in poetry. We have to see what the symbolism is. He's not going to come straight forward in many ways. You have to stop and say what the poet had in mind when he was writing this. The second thing that's always helpful is to understand the culture of that day, so we understand what is meant by the things that are said that don't exactly fit into the culture of our day for us to easily understand it. And so when we understand those 2 things, Song of Solomon is a book that comes alive. It's a book that really speaks volumes to us. And so here we are in the 5th chapter, in verse 2, and let's see what is creating conflict just right after they get married. The 5th chapter, in verse 2, she says, the Shulamite says, I sleep, but my heart, that's Solomon, is awake. It is the voice of my beloved. He knocks, saying, open for me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is covered with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. I have taken off my robe. How can I put it on again? I have washed my feet. How can I defile them? My beloved put his hand by the latch of the door. Let's pause there. Of the book of Song of Solomon, to me, there are some portions of this particular scene in this poetry that's probably the hardest to understand for certain what is meant. And it's the verses that we're going to come up to in just a moment, immediately following this. But what's interesting here is we think about her married to a king. Now, if you were here over the weekend, you know we talked about it because it's talked about here in the book. She came from a standpoint of poverty, if you will. And she had to work out in the fields like the men did. And so imagine you move from that setting and you move into a palace. And imagine the great responsibility that he had as a king. And so you can imagine that he was out doing whatever he was doing that day and running a kingdom, and he was out late. And the scripture doesn't tell us why he was out late. Or it doesn't tell us why she went to bed early. And we're not saying either one is at fault in that. Isn't that how a lot of conflict works? A lot of conflict doesn't begin because one of us are doing the wrong thing. It's because we have different opinions about things. We have different desires. At that moment, we like something different than the other one likes it. And so he's out, and he's coming in late at night. She's in bed. And they would have different quarters. That would have been the culture of living in a palace. And so he wants to come over to her quarters that night. He wants to see her that night. So he knocks on her door. She apparently wants to continue sleeping. She gives some very, very feeble excuses, doesn't she? How could I ever put my robe back on and answer the door? And I've already washed my feet. How could I touch that palace floor again with washed feet? What's a good lesson for me to learn in conflict? I want you to notice as we're about to read on, he does put his hand to check the door to see if it's locked. And it is. And what we learn in the following few lines is he turns and he walks away. You know the best way to stop conflict? Growing into some heightened state? Stop fueling it, right? Stop feeding the fire. You know, Solomon, of course, wrote most of the book of Proverbs. I want to turn back just a few pages to Proverbs, the 26th chapter, and I want to read something that he said, and it's almost common sense, but yet sometimes common sense isn't so common anymore, is it? And so in Proverbs, the 26th chapter, look what he says about times of contention in verse 20. Proverbs 26 and 20. Where there is no wood, the fire goes out. And where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. As charcoal is to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. You notice how through those two verses the idea is taking strife and comparing it to a fire. And in this sense, the fire is a negative thing. And he tells there's two things that created this fire. At least in these two verses, there's two things. And one is there's some kind of substance that's fueling this. We got this wood. We have this charcoal. And then the other thing we have is the man that's doing it. And so what if you want to stop the contention? He says, stop putting the wood on the fire. But what do we do by nature? By nature, we mirror people. Okay? I hate that about me, and really I don't like it about you, but that's our human nature, okay? We mirror people. And if you don't think by nature we mirror people, I'll give you just a quick example. You go shopping one day. Don't we love to do that? And you go shopping one day, and you walk into a store, and you go to check out. And you have no idea why, but the person that's running the cash register is having a horrible day. It might be because they've been dealing with the public. That's a pretty big challenge. For whatever reason, though, they've had a horrible day, and they're about to take it out on you, and you just walked up. And so, it's just that person that's rude to you for no reason. And so, by nature, what do? You kind of bow up a little bit, and you kind of start putting it back to them a little bit. And when they don't say, thank you for shopping with us, you just very nicely say, you're welcome. Wow, you put them in their place, didn't you? Why did you do that? Because they did it to you. I'm walking around as a full-length mirror. Hey, you give it to me, I'll give it back to you. You go into the next shop. You look around, you go to buy something, you go to the cash register. Nicest person in the world. Hey, how you doing today? Did you find everything? Hey, I like your sweater there. Yeah, great. You have a lovely conversation with them. Hey, thank you for shopping. Hey, I'll be back. I enjoyed it. What just happened? You didn't treat the other person like that. Why did you not treat the other person like that? Because you're a full-length mirror. You just walk around and you say, it's almost like a keyboard of a telephone, right? You push my buttons. You have control over me. I'm a full-length mirror. If you want me to be happy and nice, you be happy and nice, and I'll be happy and nice. You want me to be rude and sarcastic? I'll be rude and sarcastic if you'll be rude and sarcastic. You control me. Think how miserable it is to walk through life. Literally everybody, people you know and people you don't know, empower you. They literally rule your life. They have the ability to make you miserable. They have the ability to make you happy because you live a powerless life. What does the Lord call us to do? The highest and greatest commandment, and the second's likened to it. Love God with all your being. Love your neighbor as yourself. What does that word love mean? We all here know that word is agape. Agape is not tied to an emotion. Agape is not even tied to, I like you. Agape is tied to a commitment. A commitment that says, I will do, and I will make a decision to do what is right and best toward you. I will sacrificially do what is right and best toward you. And here's the tough one too. And I'll do it unconditionally. Unconditionally. If you do the right thing, I'll still do the right thing, but I won't do the right thing because you did the right thing. I'm no longer, once I became a follower of Jesus, and once I really understood what it meant to be converted and to love God with all my being and love my neighbor as myself, now I'm not a full-length mirror pointed in this direction. Now I'm a full-length mirror pointed in this direction. Now I'm going to reflect Christ. And so if you're nice to me, I'm going to be nice to you too, but it's not because of you, it's because of Him. And if you're rude, I've already made a decision. I'm going to do what's right and best in this situation, and I'll sacrifice. And so it's not at all a condition of what you are and what you do. Isn't that powerful? That's Romans 5 language. When did Christ die for us? While we were yet sinners. Human race, you're not at all what you ought to be. But I love you, for God so loved the world, He gave His only. I love you, and I'm going to sacrificially, unconditionally give for you what you needed. How many times have we looked toward the cross and we said, that's the greatest demonstration of love? Is it true? It is, isn't it? But have you thought about what Jesus did within 24 hours before going to that cross? He laid down flat on the ground and He sweated as if it were great drops of blood. And he cried. Hebrews would even say it was vehement cries. If you'd have been in the garden, you'd have probably said, is there an animal over there dying? What is that noise? No, it's our Savior. And he's crying out a prayer to God. There's moanings and words in that prayer. What is he saying to God? He's saying, God, let that cup pass from me. Not my will, but thy will be done. In other words, Lord, I don't like the thought right now of dying on that cross. If I had my emotional desire and my fleshly desire right now, I would not die on that cross. But God, I love you and I love them. Not my will, but your will be done. The greatest example of love is when we do things we absolutely don't want to do, we don't feel like doing. It just is tough for us to do. But we do it because we've made our commitment to God that we're going to love others as ourselves. Think how, if every day you and I could shatter that mirror that reflects others, build up that commitment to reflect the Lord. Think how many times we would have the opportunity to escalate conflict. Because it's going to happen. The conflict's going to happen. But instead of escalating, let's just put more wood on that. How could Solomon have done that here? He's knocking on the door. She says those words. And he could have barked back other words. In other words, does it feel good to get rejected? No, you've injured me. See, she felt injured. The height of conflict is when both parties feel injured. She felt injured, probably thinking, I can't believe it. I'm asleep and he's going to come and he's going to wake me up. Is he inconsiderate or what? He probably felt injured because I can't believe it. She's going to reject me. But then she chooses these words that offer some really flimsy excuses. Imagine what he could have barked back with. Oh, yeah. You can't put your clean feet on this palace floor? I know the dirt floor you grew up in. Remember, I've seen it. That's interesting. You put your feet on that dirt floor every day of your life. But now you can't put your feet on a palace floor. I see how you are. You're ungrateful. He didn't escalate it. She had her injury. He had his injury. And instead, he let it be. He let it be for what? And see, this is what's beautiful if we're married to a Christian. If we're married to a Christian, it's a guarantee that God will take care of it. And the question is, we have to see if we have faith in God. Your spouse's good conscience will punish them. But you know who else will punish them? God. He promises, right? At that moment, you could seek vengeance, but God says in Romans 12, what? He says, don't. He says, I'll seek vengeance. Have you read Hebrews 12 lately? Have you read those verses, how strongly God says that I punish my children because I love them? I want to just read some of these because I want to remind you. When I was studying over this morning, I thought, that's going to take too long to read that. But when I read over it, I thought, we need to be reminded of this. So I'm going to read this really quickly. If you want to turn there, I want you to look at Hebrews 12, and I want you to think about what God says, and I want you to just ask yourself, do you believe God? If God says the next time you're injured, your spouse has injured you in some way, and you're thinking, I need to punish them. And you know what we say? I've heard it in counseling. People will say, well, if I don't punish them, they're going to continue doing it. Okay, so are you saying, I know what God says, but he's wrong. And so I know a way that's better than God. Or can you humbly say, my human nature would say that if I don't punish them, they're going to continue to do this, but I know what God said, so I trust God in this. And see, that's where the power in our living is when we stop living based upon our own reasoning and we live based upon what God has told us. And so think about this. He says in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, in verse 5, my son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. Verse 6, For whom the Lord loves, He chastens and scourges every son whom He receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seems best to them, but He, notice this, for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness, holy matrimony. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. What do you want in your marriage? You want peaceable fruit of righteousness? To those who have been trained by it. Our dilemma, you know what I'm going to say already. Our dilemma is we think they've created pain and they have injured me. I must give them pain back. And God literally right here says, whoa, whoa, whoa. I promise you, I'll give the pain back. Let me discipline them. And what's beautiful is if they have a good conscience, you see it almost like that. It's amazing. We see it even in this story. Her heart changes immediately when she realizes, oh, I kind of told him to go away. And he did. Now she can put her feet on the floor and she jumps up. Now she tries to go after him. What do you think? Do you think God will do what He says He'll do? Now keep in mind, we're reading poetry here, but this is powerful if you understand what's being said in this poetry. Go back to the 5th chapter and look what happens when she gets up. Verse 6. I opened for my beloved, but my beloved had turned away and was gone. I'm in the 5th chapter, verse 6 of Song of Solomon. My heart leaped up when he spoke, and I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, and he gave no answer. Look at verse 7. The watchmen who went about the city found me. They hit me. They struck me. They wounded me. The keepers of the walls, they took my veil away from me. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, that you tell him, I am lovesick. In poetry, what did she just say? She literally is going back to the language that's strong in Hebrew poetry to talk about God building our lives and our homes. As a matter of fact, in Psalm 127 and verse 1, probably when I read this, you're going to say, oh, I remember that passage. Think how similar it is to what we just read. We just read about the watchmen and the keepers of the wall, those that stand in the towers and they guard. And notice what Psalm 127 and 1 says. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchmen stay awake in vain. You say, hey, I know what God says about things, but I really like to do it my way. God says, you go right ahead. You build your own house. But just know you're going to be like the gerbil on the wheel. You're going to work and work and work and work, and you're going to try to build a good marriage, and when it's said and done, it still won't be a holy marriage. You're working and you're running in vain. Unless you allow the Lord to build your house, you're building in vain. What about guarding your house? We see a lot of marriages that don't make it. In other words, the Lord did not guard their home. Unless the Lord guards your house, the watchman stays awake in vain. Hey, Lord, we want to do it our way. We can handle marriage. We can do it the way we want to do it. And the Lord says, okay, you stay up all night guarding your home your way, and just know there's enemies more powerful than you. Isn't that a sobering thought? I don't know if you've thought about it this way lately, but I ask you just think about this. Sobering thought. The day you said I do, There was an enemy that wanted to destroy your godly influence in a Christian home. Now, God doesn't, I don't think Satan has the thought, I would not think, who am I to know, but I wouldn't think Satan thinks, I've got to make sure that every home ends in divorce, because he gets a lot of mileage out of ungodly homes and dysfunctional homes that stay together. And so, what we know Satan, the day you and I said to our spouses, I do, what we know Satan was against was the idea of you having a godly home that thrives because you're a reflection of God in every way. We know he was against that. And here's what's sobering. He's more powerful than you and your spouse. You cannot stand against Satan on your own. Unless you allow the Lord to build your house, you won't stand against him, no matter how determined you are and no matter what your parents did and your great-grandparents did and your great-great-grandparents did. And you won't be able to guard your home from the snares of Satan unless you allow the Lord to guard your home. What did she have? When we look at her, she literally is saying here, I went out in the streets and God found me and God punished me. It's poetry to say God disciplined me. The rest of the next 2 chapters is about them meeting up again and about how her esteem for him is high and how he loves her and he welcomes her back. And this moment that was stressful at the beginning is greatly resolved. And I want you to notice the power of this. In the 6th chapter, in verse 11 and 12, we see that he lifts her up. He doesn't try to punish her. As a matter of fact, the close of 12 is, before I was even aware, my soul had made me as the chariots of my noble people. In other words, he says, instead of beating me down, he's put me in the king's chariot and he's rolled me around for everybody to see. His wife. He's not beating me down, he's lifting me up. So what is the result of this conflict? And this is what we hope we all would be able to say in times of conflict. Look at verse 13. Return, return, O Shulamite, return, return, that we may look upon you. What would you see in the Shulamite? As it were, the dance of 2 camps. The conflict is over. Who's rejoicing? The husband or the wife? The conflict is over, and 2 camps are rejoicing. If in your marriage regularly one of you wins and the other one loses, that is a very unhealthy sign. What you want in marriage is for you to go through conflict and neither one is declared a winner. What you both have done has submitted to God and we've allowed God to win. The greatest resolution for godly families is when both can sit down and say, we strongly disagree about this. The first place, let's start. What is God's will in this? And if that settles it, that's where it stops. God's will be done. The dance, the celebration of both camps. May God bless us. I hope you have a lot of conflict in your marriage because I hope you're that close to each other. I hope you live so close to each other that you know what each other's thinking and you're comfortable and honest enough to say, I don't really agree with that. But then I hope you love the Lord enough, to allow His grace and peace to be a part of your life.